down on the floor. The ballroom on the 62nd floor of a Manhattan tower had never hosted a night quite like this one. Chandeliers spilled soft gold light across the marble, champagne glasses clinked between 200 of the city's wealthiest guests, and the woman everyone had come to see moved through the crowd with practiced calm. Elena Marchetti was 38, founder and CEO of a technology empire worth tens of billions. 2 decades of building something from nothing had left her polished, composed, and thin on patience for small talk. She didn't believe in heroes. She believed in numbers, contracts, and people who could be measured and predicted. That belief was about to break in front of everyone in the room. Near the far wall, unremarkable in a plain dark suit among the designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, stood a man named Marcus Reyes. 40 years old, broad-shouldered, still in a way most people mistook for boredom. Officially, he was one of several contractors hired to walk the perimeter and look serious. Nobody in that ballroom knew he had once led a Navy SEAL team through missions the country would never hear about, or that he'd spent years training himself to notice the one wrong detail in a room full of 1,000 ordinary ones. It happened in an instant. Marcus's eyes lifted to the balcony above the dance floor, and his whole face changed. The boredom vanished, replaced by a focus so total it seemed to still the air around him. He didn't hesitate. He didn't ask questions. He simply opened his mouth and roared one command across the entire room, a voice built to cut through chaos and be obeyed instantly. "Get down!" For one full second, nobody moved. A few guests assumed he'd simply lost his mind. Then the world exploded into noise. A window shattering inward, glass raining across the tables, a second shot somewhere above sending the massive chandelier swinging on a grazed chain. Screams broke out from every direction as people dove beneath tables and waiters dropped trays that shattered against the floor. In 3 seconds, the most exclusive party of the year became pure chaos. And standing frozen in the open, directly in the line of fire, was Elena Marchetti. Marcus crossed 20 feet of ballroom faster than anyone there believed a body could move, weaving through falling glass and bodies with the fluid economy of a man who'd done this in far worse places. He reached her in under 2 seconds, drove his shoulder into her, and took them both down behind an overturned banquet table just as a third shot splintered the wood above their heads. He wasn't thinking about who she was, or the cameras, or her fortune. He was thinking about the angle of fire, the nearest exit, and keeping a stranger breathing for one more minute. For almost a full minute the gunfire continued in short bursts while Marcus directed the chaos with the calm authority of a man giving battlefield orders, though almost no one realized that's exactly what was happening. He waved people toward a service corridor, pulled an elderly man from beneath a collapsed table, shielded a young waitress with his own back as another window blew in. By the time security arrived, weapons drawn and faces pale, the shooting was already over. They found a man in a torn suit calmly checking pulses and counting heads, as though he'd done it 100 times and expected to do it again. Elena sat on the cold marble floor, glass in her hair, hands trembling for the first time in longer than she could remember, staring at the man who'd thrown himself into gunfire for a stranger. Something in her carefully built world had cracked open. She didn't know his name yet. She only knew, with a certainty that startled her more than the gunshots had, that the quiet man in the dark suit was not who this room had assumed him to be, and that meeting him properly was no longer optional. The story broke before sunrise. Every outlet in the city ran some version of the same headline: an armed attack at an elite gala, and a mysterious security guard who'd saved dozens of lives with what witnesses called impossible speed. Detectives replayed the same 11 seconds of footage for hours, unable to fully explain how one man had crossed a crowded ballroom, neutralized the threat, and organized an evacuation before uniformed officers even reached the building. Elena watched the same footage alone in her penthouse office at 4 a.m, rewinding it more times than she'd admit to anyone. She wanted to meet him, thank him, understand him. She had her assistant track down his contact information through the security firm. The reply that came back was polite, brief, and final. Marcus Reyes had no interest in interviews or publicity and respectfully declined any meeting. When she pushed harder, using the kind of leverage that had opened every closed door in her career, she finally got one line from him, delivered through an intermediary because he wouldn't give out his personal number: "I only did what I was trained to do. Nothing more." That single sentence bothered her more than any negotiation she'd ever lost. Elena was used to people wanting something from her. Marcus Reyes wanted nothing at all, which made him the most interesting person she'd met in years. She started quietly pulling whatever background her resources could legally access, and what she found only deepened the mystery. His military file was mostly redacted, years of deployments blacked out, commendations described in the vaguest terms, and an abrupt departure from the Navy at the height of what should have been a rising career. No scandal, no dishonorable discharge. Just a name, a date, and silence after, as if a man who'd spent 2 decades in the world's most dangerous places had simply decided to disappear into an ordinary life of quiet consulting in early mornings. Rather than push for another meeting he'd only refuse, Elena did something more direct. Her company was opening a new headquarters downtown, a glass tower full of proprietary technology, and the board had spent months arguing over security contractors without settling on one. She authorized a formal contract through her legal department, purely business on paper, offering Marcus's firm a full evaluation of the building before the grand opening. In her own mind she knew exactly what she was doing, and she suspected he did too. Several board members balked the moment his name appeared on the proposal. One senior executive dismissed him outright as an old soldier with a lucky reflex. Elena said nothing in his defense. She just told the board to watch, and scheduled the walkthrough for the next morning. Marcus arrived exactly on time, dressed plainly, carrying only a notebook and a flashlight. He walked the perimeter once in complete silence, studying angles and camera placement with an intensity that made the accompanying staff visibly uncomfortable. Within 20 minutes he'd identified 3 blind spots the camera network had missed for over a year, a critical flaw in the biometric access system, and a service entrance whose badge reader wasn't even in company records. None of it had been caught by the firm the board had almost hired instead. The room went quiet. Even the executive who'd dismissed him had nothing left to say. Elena stood at the back, arms folded, watching. Struck less by the brilliance of his findings than by the complete absence of ego in how he delivered them. He never once glanced her way, never performed for the woman signing the check. It was the first time in years she'd stood in a room with a man entirely uninterested in impressing her, and it fascinated her more than she wanted to admit. That fascination sent her digging deeper, this time hiring an independent researcher with contacts inside the veteran community. What came back, slowly, was the outline of a man shaped by loss. Marcus had once led a small team on a mission that went badly wrong under circumstances still classified, a mission where 2 of his men never came home. People who'd served with him described a leader who blamed himself for every decision that night, long after command had cleared him of fault. The researcher also found something Marcus had never mentioned at the company. He was a single father raising a young daughter, Sophia, after a marriage that quietly ended a few years after he came home. Friends spoke off the record about a marriage that wore away under the weight of everything he carried, a wife who loved him but couldn't keep living beside a man who woke screaming some nights and said nothing about it by morning. He'd chosen his daughter over everything else, building a small, careful, unremarkable life in a house outside the city. Elena read the report twice, and somewhere in the second reading her understanding of him shifted completely. She'd assumed his silence was simple discipline. Now she understood it was heavier than that, not emptiness, but a wound folded so carefully into an ordinary routine that almost no one ever noticed it was there. For the first time, she found herself wanting to know Marcus Reyes not because he'd saved her life, but because she recognized, in some guarded corner of her own heart, exactly what it looked like to hide pain behind competence. She also learned, quietly, that he visited a small cemetery outside the city on the same weekend every month, alone, without fail, where his 2 fallen teammates were buried beneath simple granite markers. One former teammate, willing to speak candidly, told her that Marcus had made a private promise there never to let another person under his protection come to harm again. Elena understood then that his fierce, unspoken dedication to her safety wasn't just professionalism. It was a debt he'd been quietly paying for years to men who could no longer thank him for it. Word of his assessment spread through the company, and the board that had once dismissed him quietly asked him to stay on in a broader advisory role. He accepted on the condition that his work stay unglamorous and largely invisible, long, methodical audits rather than public appearances. Elena found herself increasingly present at those sessions, even when her attendance wasn't required, telling herself it was curiosity about her own company's vulnerabilities, though she knew, somewhere beneath the reasoning, it was mostly an excuse to be near a man who never once asked her for anything. Those weeks gave her a first real glimpse of who he was outside of crisis. She watched him patiently walk junior staff through basic threat awareness, correcting mistakes without condescension, praising small improvements with a warmth that seemed at odds with his file. She noticed the way he checked his phone at exactly the same time every afternoon, the hour his daughter's school day ended, a small, steady ritual he never let slip, no matter how demanding his schedule became. The peace didn't last. A private investigator working with Elena's security team uncovered evidence that the gunfire at the gala had been no random act at all, but a calculated attack financed through a shell company tied to Draven Systems, a rival tech firm locked in a bitter, years-long battle with Elena's company over a defense contract worth billions. The attack had never been about chaos. It had been an attempt on Elena's life, meant to remove her from a negotiation that hadn't gone Draven's way. Marcus delivered the news himself, standing in her office with the same grave stillness he'd shown the night of the shooting, and warned her plainly that whoever ordered the attack would try again now that the first attempt had failed. Elena's instinct, honed by 2 decades of never backing down from a fight, was to refuse any suggestion of hiding. She told him flatly she wouldn't disappear into a bunker while men in expensive suits decided her fate behind closed doors. Marcus studied her for a long moment, something like respect crossing his face, then nodded and told her that if she wouldn't run, he'd make sure she didn't have to. From then on they worked closely together, no longer separated by the formal distance of client and contractor. He reviewed her daily schedule, walked her building stairwells at odd hours, and retrained her private security team in protocols most of them had never seen outside classified briefings. Elena started arriving early to the sessions he ran, watching him move through drills with an economy of motion that looked almost like choreography. Something quieter and more human began growing between them in the middle of spreadsheets and surveillance photos, a rare half-smile when she made a dry joke during a tense strategy session, the way she found herself glancing at the clock on the days he was scheduled to visit. Neither of them named it, both too disciplined, too wary of vulnerability, while real danger still hung over her life. But late one evening, reaching for the same folder while reviewing footage long after the building had emptied, their hands brushed and neither of them pulled away. Marcus insisted she learn basic defensive skills herself, arguing that no security detail could guarantee her safety in every moment of every day. She resisted at first, half amused by the idea of practicing wrist grab escapes in an empty gym after hours, but agreed, mostly because it meant more time in his company than either of them cared to admit. He was a patient teacher, correcting her stance with a light touch, never raising his voice even when her frustration boiled over. Slowly she found herself trusting not just his judgment but his steadiness, the sense that nothing could truly go wrong so long as he was standing in the room. One night, walking her down to a waiting car after a session that ran long, Marcus paused at the entrance and studied the street before letting her step outside, an old habit so natural he barely noticed doing it. Elena watched him and felt something settle in her chest that she recognized, uneasily, as safety. She didn't say anything about it. She just thanked him the way she always did and told herself the warmth she felt was nothing more than gratitude. She didn't quite believe it. The second attack came without warning, exactly as Marcus had predicted, on an evening Elena was set to fly out from a private helipad for an overseas meeting. A small explosive near the front gate drew nearly her entire security detail away within seconds, leaving Marcus alone with her and a few stunned ground crew as 3 armed men came over the perimeter fence. There was no time to call for backup. What followed was over in under 4 minutes, though to Elena it felt like a lifetime compressed into a single held breath. Marcus read the terrain instantly, positioned her behind the helicopter's reinforced steel frame, and moved to intercept the first gunman with a speed that seemed to defy ordinary physics. He disarmed him in one motion, used the man's own weapon against the second attacker before he'd registered what was happening, and when the third seized a terrified crew member as a shield, talked him down with a calm, controlled voice that carried more authority than any shout could have. Within minutes all 3 men lay subdued and the hostage walked away shaking but unharmed. When it was over, when police lights began flashing at the gate and the adrenaline slowly drained from his shoulders, Marcus turned to check on Elena with the same soft concern he always showed, as if the violence moments earlier had already been filed away somewhere separate from the man standing in front of her. Sitting together afterward in the back of an ambulance, Elena finally asked the question she'd carried since the night of the gala. Why he'd walked away from a career that so clearly still lived inside him. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching the lights reflect off the gravel, before telling her that after losing men who trusted him completely, he'd decided he could no longer risk being the reason someone else's family got the kind of phone call his own men's families once had. Elena said nothing. She just reached over and took his hand, and for once neither of them needed more words. In the weeks that followed, something between them finally softened into something neither tried to hide. Elena invited him to dinner, not at one of the photographed restaurants where she usually entertained investors, but a small quiet place near the harbor where nobody recognized either of their faces. They didn't discuss threat assessments that night. For the first time since they'd met, they simply talked. She told him about growing up in a cramped apartment in Ohio, a single mother working 2 jobs, scholarship applications written by candlelight when the power had been shut off again, and the quiet belief she'd carried for years that love was just another risk she couldn't afford. Marcus listened without interrupting, and something in the space between them opened a little wider. Draven Systems didn't wait quietly for the walls to close in. As federal investigators circled, someone inside gave the order for a final, desperate move. Elena would be taken and held at an abandoned warehouse complex on the edge of the industrial district, chosen because it sat outside most surveillance networks and offered half a dozen escape routes. Marcus urged her to disappear from public view until the threat was neutralized, but there wasn't time. 2 masked men intercepted her car outside a board meeting the next afternoon, and within 90 seconds she was forced into a black van and driven away before her own detail could react. Marcus got the alert less than 3 minutes later, and something in him went cold and utterly focused, the same focus that had once kept his entire team alive through the worst night of his career. He tracked the van through traffic camera footage faster than any analyst on her payroll could, cross-referenced it against a warehouse location he'd already flagged days earlier, and reached the complex in under 20 minutes. Alone, refusing to wait for backup that might arrive too late. Moving through the shadows with silent, practiced steps, he found Elena bound to a metal chair in a back office, guarded by 2 men who had no idea what had just walked quietly through their perimeter. He took the first down without a sound. The second fight was louder, a violent struggle that sent shelving crashing down as he absorbed a blow meant to break his jaw and answered with a speed the man never saw coming. A third and fourth attacker arrived, drawn by the noise, and for one terrible moment it seemed the numbers might finally overwhelm him. It was Elena, still bound to the chair, who spotted the timer on a device wired to the building's gas line, a failsafe the kidnappers had planted to erase evidence if the plan collapsed, and screamed the warning across the chaos. Marcus dropped the last attacker in seconds and rushed to cut her free, his hands steady despite everything his body had just endured. They cleared the building together with under 90 seconds left on the clock, Marcus half carrying her through a side exit as the device detonated behind them in a burst of flame that lit up the skyline. Elena collapsed against him on the gravel outside, alive, shaking, held by someone who'd risked everything simply to make sure she survived. They sat together for a long while after the flames settled into smoke, saying nothing, just breathing in the strange quiet that follows survival. Marcus kept his arm around her long after the danger passed, and Elena found she didn't want him to let go. When the first police vehicles arrived, he helped her to her feet with a gentleness that felt entirely at odds with the violence he'd just unleashed minutes earlier. And she understood, watching him, that the 2 sides of him had never really been separate at all. The same discipline that made him lethal in a fight was the discipline that made him careful and devoted to the people he chose to protect. The arrests came fast once federal investigators moved on the evidence Marcus and Elena's teams had assembled together. Within days, the executives behind Draven Systems who had orchestrated both attacks were in custody, their financial trail laid bare. The story dominated the news for a week, no longer a mysterious shooting at a gala, but the full account of a former Navy SEAL who had single-handedly foiled 2 assassination attempts and a kidnapping against one of the country's most powerful women. Reporters camped outside Marcus's modest house for days. He declined every interview, more concerned with keeping his daughter's school routine undisturbed than with any recognition. Elena felt a different obligation. She called her own press conference, not to discuss stock prices or the federal case, but to speak plainly about the man who had refused to let her die. Standing before a room of reporters, she set aside decades of careful corporate language. "He didn't save my life because he wanted anything from me," she told them, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. He did it because that's simply who he is, and he reminded me, at a point when I had nearly forgotten, that real courage still exists in this world. Quietly, without needing an audience, Marcus stood near the exit of that room in the same plain dark suit he'd worn the night of the gala, there only because Elena had asked him to, personally, once. For the first time since any camera had turned toward him, he let himself do something reporters would later describe, almost in disbelief, as an actual smile. Brief, genuine, entirely without performance. Not the smile of a man enjoying attention he'd spent his life avoiding, but of a man who'd finally let someone else say, out loud, the things he'd never let himself believe about his own worth. Months passed before either of them spoke publicly about what had grown between them, though those closest to Elena's company had long since stopped pretending not to notice. The corporate war with Draven Industries ended in disgrace and dissolution for the rival firm, and Elena, more reflective than her board had ever seen her, decided to build something meaningful out of everything the past year had cost her. She founded a foundation supporting veterans transitioning back into civilian life. Job training, mental health resources, small business grants for people who, like Marcus, often found themselves navigating a world that no longer quite fit who the war had shaped them into becoming. Marcus agreed, after considerable persuading, to lead the Foundation's security training division, work that let him mentor young veterans and teach the discipline he'd spent his adult life mastering, without ever stepping fully into the spotlight Elena still occasionally had to navigate. Together they built the program from nothing, spending long hours in shared offices sketching curriculum and interviewing staff. Somewhere in that quiet, patient work, the careful boundaries that had once defined their relationship simply stopped mattering. Sophia, old enough now to understand a little more of what her father had once done, adored Elena from the first afternoon they met, chattering about school and insisting, with the blunt honesty only a child can offer, that Elena should just come to dinner more often. The Foundation's first graduating class found jobs within weeks of finishing the program, a small but undeniable victory that meant more to Marcus than any commendation he'd earned in uniform. He stood at the back of the small ceremony, watching young men and women who reminded him painfully of the friends he'd lost accept certificates and shake hands with new employers, and for the first time in years he let himself feel something like pride instead of guilt when he thought about his service. Elena stood beside him, watching him watch them, understanding that this, more than any rescue or headline, was the truest measure of the man she'd come to love. Their relationship deepened slowly and deliberately, in the unhurried way of two people who'd both learned the hard way what it cost to move too fast towards something fragile. There were quiet dinners at his small house outside the city, evenings helping Sophia with homework at the kitchen table while something simmered on the stove, ordinary moments that felt more precious to Elena than any gala she'd ever attended. Marcus, in turn, learned to sit beside her through long board calls, learned the particular silence she needed after a hard negotiation, learned that the woman the world saw as untouchable simply wanted someone who would stay. On a quiet evening in early autumn, they stood together on the rooftop terrace of Elena's building, the city stretched out below an amber light as the sun dipped behind the skyline. Elena leaned against the railing beside him, a glass of wine forgotten in her hand, and asked, half teasing and half entirely serious, how much longer exactly he intended to keep protecting her. Marcus turned to look at her, an easy, unguarded expression on his face that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who'd only known the watchful man from the night of the gala, and told her simply that he intended to keep protecting her for the rest of his life, if she'd let him. Elena reached for his hand without hesitation. For a long, quiet moment neither of them said anything else, needing nothing more than the warmth of that gesture and the city glowing gold behind them. There was no billionaire on that rooftop, and no decorated soldier either, only two people who had each carried their own private weight of grief for far too long, and who had somehow found in each other a place to finally set it down. Below them, the city kept moving, indifferent and enormous, entirely unaware that somewhere above its noise and light, two guarded hearts had quietly, finally come home to each other, and that whatever storms still waited for them in the years ahead, they would not have to face a single one of them alone again.